I'm Gary White with my lead anchor. I'm here with co-anchor
Susan Brooks.
And in today's news, we'll be discussing the McCarthy era, the Berlin blockade, the Bay of Pigs, and finally the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is the McCarthy era, you may ask? Why don't we go to our field reporter, Wendy Garshner, for more information.
With the growing fear of communism in the United States, more and more citizens are coming out of the shadows and expressing what they feel towards communism. As I have here 30-year-old Mark, from resident of a small town in Virginia. Sir, what comes to mind when you hear the word communism?
Fear. For all I know, my neighbor is a communist. For all I know, you're a communist, and nobody will ever know. That is a problem with communism. You can't really tell if someone is a communist, and in my opinion, that strikes more fear into individuals.
For those communists who are caught in the United States, what do you think the best punishment is for?
I believe we should kill them all. That's the best punishment because even behind bars, they will be able to spread their ideas inside prison, and potential inmates who are on the verge of being released may carry on their ideas onto the public. Killing them is the best solution, period. We cannot let communism spread in the United States, for this is the land of freedom and democracy. This is America, and it's not the Soviet Union.
To those communists who are watching the broadcast live, what is one thing you would like to tell them, sir?
To get out of our country. We don't want you evil people here spreading your evil ideologies to the citizens of this beautiful country.
Beautiful country indeed. Sir, any last words for the following citizens who are living in fear?
Don't be afraid to speak out and come out of the shadows. God bless America.
Thank you, sir. Turning back to the studio, Wendy Garshner here.
Reporting live from Virginia. Thank you for that insightful interview covering the McCarthy era. We will be back after this short break to discuss the Berlin blockade.
Everybody doing it, jumping for joy. Boy, almond joy. Boy, almond joy from Peter Paul. Finest tasting candy of all. Take golden toasted almonds, crisp whole almonds, dipped in smooth milk chocolate to seal in that fresh roasted flavor. Then bring on the coconut, so juicy, so tender, and top it all with real milk chocolate. Boy, almond joy, juicy coconut, real milk chocolate, and golden toasted almonds on every double bar. Peter Paul Almond Joy, indescribably delicious.
With your lead anchor, Garrett White, and co-anchor Susan Brooks. I'm here to cover the Berlin blockade, which was a product of the Cold War as it was just beginning. The Berlin blockade was the agreement after World War II to divide Germany and Berlin into occupation zones. On February 1945, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West had deteriorated steadily. Because of this dispute, the United Nations Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was presented on March 4, 1946, increasing the emphasis on U.S. foreign policy on the containment of Russian expansion, Soviet hostility towards the Marshall Plan, and expanding Western commitment to establish a separate capitalist West Germany. On March 1948, the Allied powers decided to unite their different occupation zones in Germany into a single economic unit. In protest, the Soviet representative withdrew from the Allied Control Council, coincidence with the introduction of the new Deutschmark in West Berlin, what the Soviets regarded as a violation of their agreements with the Allies. The Soviet occupation forces in eastern Germany began a blockade of all rail, road, and water communications between Berlin and the West. This sums up our story covering the Berlin blockade. We are now switching over to our field reporter, Scott Cooper.
Good evening. My name is Scott Cooper, and I'm standing outside the Presidential Palace here in Washington, D.C., where President Kennedy has just announced that the United States was responsible for the invasion of Bay of Pigs in Cuba. President Kennedy gave the speech addressing this event. The story goes like this. On April 15, 1961, a group of Cuban exiles trained and funded by CIA operatives were sent on the planes from Nicaragua. These B-26 planes were painted like Cuban planes, and they were headed to strike on Cuban airfields. However, Fidel and his advisors knew about the incoming strike before it happened and were able to move their planes out of harm's way. 2 days later, the United States attempted to attack Cuba again and failed miserably. On April 17, 1961, the United States sent around 1,200 Cuban exiles to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. When this happened, the Cuban exiles washed up on shore on the American landing crafts and armed with American weapons. Their plan was to overthrow the communist dictator Fidel Castro. However, when the Cuban exiles washed up ashore. The landing crafts were almost immediately destroyed by the Cuban Air Force, and the Cuban military was able to quickly take control. On that day, 100 Cuban exiles were killed and the rest. If the Cuban exiles were successful in invading Cuba, they could weaken Cuba's military by destroying their planes and by fighting against the military. The people of Cuba would also rise and revolt against Fidel's communist dictatorship. One of the reasons why the United States invaded Cuba was because of Castro's success in nationalizing U.S. companies, which jeopardized and effectively ended U.S. interests in Cuba. Other justifications for the invasions are to end his inflammatory anti-American rhetoric and minimize the threat that Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union imposed upon the United States Western Hemisphere. When these allegations surfaced, the United States denied their involvement in Cuba. A similar situation occurred in Guatemala in 1954, where the CIA sent 480 men to overthrow Democratic-elect President Jacobo Arbenz because of his communist ideals. Seeing as these events have repeatedly occurred in the past, it is important to remember that the United States was founded on the principles of freedom. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more information. Back to you, Suzanne.
Good evening, and thanks for tuning in to watch tonight's news. I'm Susan Brooks, and tonight we'll be discussing the turmoil that kept Americans on edge these past 14 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a crisis that caught us Americans by surprise and at the brink of a nuclear war with the USSR. Only a few days after the tensions rose between the US and the USSR, our US intelligence jets spotted secret installation of nuclear weapons, only 90 miles away from the United States. Now we will head over to Scott Cooper, who's standing in front of the White House with more information.
Sam, but as you can see here, you can still feel the tension within these streets in front of the White House. The shock America holds still because we were so close to a nuclear war. Once Kennedy received the information about the missiles, he immediately called his ex-com together to combat the issue on October 16th, leading to the speech he made to us American citizens to be aware of what was to come and how his plan was to overcome this.
Evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand. Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
This speech, not only did we feel a rush of fear, but with this came the need for action and need in the White House. The DEFCON 3 went into effort, which means the U.S. to prepare for any little military strike on Cuba. Now back to you, Susan and Granite, with more information on that.
Thank you, Scott. Now for more information on the process of the quarantine, which went into effect October 24th, Garrett, what is your opinion on this?
Not only does it seem to bring fear to all of us, of course, but it rose tensions up to be closer to a nuclear war. Now the fact that Soviet ships began to turn back on October 25th and the installations of nuclear arms accelerated shows that Cuba and the USSR were aware that the US was going to act against them.
Yes, you are right, Garrett. My family and I watched the speech in fear. Will the nuclear war begin between these two superpowers? But I am glad, and I'm sure we all are, to know that a consensus was made between the two, that the U.S. was not to invade Cuba and remove the nuclear weapons from Turkey and Germany, while the USSR is to remove all the nuclear weapons from Cuba, and I'm glad that these two superpowers were conscious of the war that would have started.
That's very true, Susan, and I'm glad we ended tonight's broadcast with a good, safe note. Tune in tomorrow for daily news and have a safe night.